All right, so the plan for today is to quickly take up quiz 2, and then I'll tell you about the exam. All right, so there's two versions of quiz 2, so I'm going to do the quiz 2A first, so the white paper. All right, so in the white paper, you got this class called range A. Oh, wait, sorry, that doesn't work. Hang on. Oh, I got to... There we go. Okay, so we have a class called range A. You were given two fields, min and max. Right? You weren't asked to add extra fields. And you were told that a range represents a range of values, right, from min to max. Some people, well, I guess one or two students actually added in a list or an array and then put in all the values between min and max in the list or the array, which didn't really make sense for this question. You didn't lose any marks if you did that, but it certainly didn't make any sense. The first question says implement the constructor, right, and throw an exception if you have to. Right, you were told that the min is always less than the max, right? So you throw an exception if the min is greater than or equal to the max, right? And then what does a constructor do? Well, it sets the fields of the class, right? So you just set min and max. So that one was relatively straightforward. The next question, there was a little bit of a trick in it. So the next question was, you're given the width of a range as an int, right? Now make a range given that width. Right, given the minimum value of the range and the width of the range, right, and make it a static method. So you were told, you're given the method, so you knew it was static, right? And again, you were told throw an exception if you have to, right? So the question says you can't have negative widths or widths of 0, so check, right? Is the width less than or equal to 0, right? Now you're given the width, you're not given the max, and the only constructor you have is the one that takes in the max. So now you have to compute the max. Right, which is the min plus the width, right? Oh, actually, there's an error here, sorry. Min, even my answer is wrong. There you go. So you have to compute the max, right? But the problem is you're adding something, you're adding two ints together, right? And when you add two ints together, they can overflow, right? So to compute the max correctly, you have to compute it as a long or a double or something else. I guess long and double are the only things that actually work properly. So you have to compute it as a long. And you have to make sure that the addition happens using long arithmetic, right? And now after you compute the max, you have to realize that, hey, the max might be bigger than the largest integer value. So that's the other constraint, right? The range class here is very strange because it can't actually represent all ranges of integers, right? So now you check, is the max greater than integer max value? And if it is, you throw an exception because you can't actually make the range. After that, you just set min and max. And then finally, for the last question, overlaps. So I showed you in class one way to do it. There is another way to do it. Right? So one way to compute do two ranges overlap is if the first range contains either the min or the max of the other range. And then compute, does the other range contain the min or the max of the first range. Right? And so you could write out four if statements here, but it's much easier to write a separate method called contains. Right? Contains returns true if the range contains that value, right? And now you can write it as four calls to contains, right? But it's actually much easier to compute whether or not the ranges don't overlap and then negate the result. The next question was the temperature question. So the question here is you've got this class. You want it to be able to represent temperatures in both degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to remember what the unit is in the class, like what units the temperature was created with. Right, so if someone makes a temperature of 0 degrees Celsius, you want your object to remember it's 0 degrees Celsius, right, and not possibly 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So you need at least one field to store the temperature. Right? So the way I'm going to do it here, I'll show you, there's like 3 or 4 different ways you can implement this class. So I'm going to do this by storing the temperature, but I'm going to store it always in degrees Celsius. Right? And now I need to somehow record whether or not this temperature is in Celsius or is it in Fahrenheit. Right? And there's lots of ways to do that. Right? So you can use a Boolean value, right? True if it's in Celsius, false otherwise. Right? You could use a string and store the units as either F or C. You can use a car, store the units as F or C. Or you can use an int and store the units as 0 or 1 or something like that, right? You have to store the units somehow. So once you do that, now you can make your constructor, right? So the constructor is make a temperature of 0 degrees Celsius, right? So 0 degrees, and it's Celsius, right? The next one was make a temperature, create a constructor where they give you the temperature value and they give you the units, right? So because I'm storing my units as a Boolean, I'm just going to make a constructor that takes in the temperature and the units, right? So if it's Celsius, I can just store their temperature in my degrees C field because I'm always storing the temperature in degrees Celsius, right? And then I can set is C or is Celsius to true, right? Otherwise, if they give me a temperature in Fahrenheit, I convert their temperature to Fahrenheit like that, right? Not like, oops, sorry. Not like that, right? If you do that, you have an int division error, right? 5 divided by 9 is 0, and so you always get a temperature of 0. So you have to make sure that one of those values is a float of some kind, right? So force one of them to be a float, compute the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, and then set is Celsius to false. Right. The next question was return the temperature in the unit, return the numeric value of the temperature that the temperature was created with, right? So if someone makes a temperature of 10 degrees Celsius, you return 10. If someone makes a temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you return 20, right? I'm always storing the temperature in degrees Celsius, so if the temperature is in degrees Celsius, I just return degrees C, right? Otherwise, I return the temperature in Fahrenheit, and that was the next question that was the next method you were asked to implement, right? So get the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. Well, my temperature is always in degrees Celsius, so I just convert it to Fahrenheit. And away you go. Equals, right? You always do that, right? There's always the 4 steps. If you use get class, there's always 4 steps, right? If you're using instance of, there's 3, right? But they have to all be there, right? The override for equals is always that, right? It's not equals temperature 1, comma temperature 2, or object 1 or object 2 or something like that, right? It's always equals some object, right? And don't forget, these have to be done in this order. Well, the first one can be anywhere, but the other 3 have to be done in that order, right? Now, the correct answer is because I'm storing my temperature as a float, right? I really should use double to long bits, but if you just did equals equals, that was fine, right? So I don't care if you used equals equals or not, right? My temperature is always in degrees Celsius. So, and the question says return true if the temperatures are equivalent, right? I think that's what it said. I think it was if they have the same temperature in degrees Celsius. 2 temp objects are equal if they represent the same temperature when measured in degrees Celsius. Yeah. Right? But it doesn't matter if you measure them in degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit. It's the same answer. Right? So here I can just compare degrees C. Right? All right. So that's not the only way to do this question. Right? There is another. There are several different ways to do this question. Right? So the other way, another way to do this question is to store the temperature in degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit at the same time. Right? So I'm just going to quickly edit this. I guess I should pull up the comments because I'm going to change stuff. Right? So you could do the following. Right? So you can put in 2 fields, one for the temperature in degrees Celsius, one for the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. Right? If you do this, though, you still need that 3rd field. Right? Because you don't know what the temperature, what units were used to create the temperature if you use 2 separate fields up here. Right? So a common mistake here was when you set the temperature in degrees Celsius, you just do this. Right? So they never set degrees Fahrenheit. Right? Which you really should do. Right? So if you're going to do it this way, then you really should set degrees Fahrenheit as well. Right? Dot, dot, dot. So that's just the formula. I'm not going to type it in. Right? Now, I'm going to not set this intentionally to show you what the problem is if you don't have that 3rd field. So here, you're going to set degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit. Right? So again, let me just strike this. Right? And then you really should set degrees Fahrenheit here. Here, you should set degrees Celsius, and you should set degrees Fahrenheit here. Here you'd set it to DEG, right? And again, I'm going to get rid of that line there for now. Okay, so get temperature value. So this is where you run into problems, right? You're asked to get the temperature value, but if you don't know the units, you don't know which of the two fields to return, right? So now you're stuck. Right? So now how do you implement that? You can't implement it correctly, right? Degrees Fahrenheit, this is easy though, right? So there is an advantage to doing it this way. To implement this method, you just return degrees Fahrenheit, right? So that's easy. Equals is also easy because if you're setting degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit all the time, equals, you can just compare degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit and it doesn't matter, right? But the one method you run into a problem is here, right? The most common mistake when doing this question this way is that the student would set only one of the two fields at any time. And there you really run into problems, right? So if you only set degrees Celsius here, right, then degrees Fahrenheit also becomes 0 in this case. Right here, if you only set one of the two, then the other one becomes 0. Right here, you still don't know how to implement the method. Here, you can't return degrees Fahrenheit anymore because you probably didn't set it correctly in the constructor. And then equals, you also run into problems because you haven't set one of your two temperatures, right? And you don't know what the unit is, so you don't know which values to compare. There's yet another way to do this one. Okay, so you can do it this way if you really want to, and not add the third field in. Right? So you can not add the third field in if you can somehow come up with a number that indicates that the field is not set. Right? So you can't use null. So that was another mistake that was made. Right? You can't use null because these are primitives. Right? If you really wanted to use null, you could make them objects, and that would work. So that would be okay. Now you can use null to indicate that it's not set, but no one actually did that. Right? So now the question is what value can I use to indicate that the temperature is not set? Right? And now you have to make some sort of argument for a number that doesn't make sense. Right? So if you happen to know that there's an absolute 0, right, minus 273.153 Celsius, right, you can use any number that's less than that and argue that this is correct. Right? So if you're going to do it that way, you still have to set degrees for both fields. Right, equals minus, I don't know, like something like that. Right? Use some giant negative value. Right? And now you can check, right? Is this field a large negative value? Right? I guess equal to, what did I put down, 100,000? Yeah, minus 100,000. Right? If it is, then I know that it's in degrees Celsius. Right? Similarly here, minus like that. And here, I would set that to minus. Right? So you could attempt to do it this way. Be fine for the quiz. Right? This would be an acceptable solution for the quiz. But at some point, you need to be able to resolve what were the units that were used to create the temperature. Right? By far, the easiest way to do this is with one field for the temperature. One field for the temperature, and then a second field for the unit. Right? I guess there is another way to do this. You could just store private temp. Right? So that would just be the numeric value of the temperature that when the person creates the object. Right? So you don't necessarily store it in degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit. Right? It changes depending on whether or not C is true or false. Right? So for example, if C is false, then your temperature is in Fahrenheit. Right? And if C is true, then your temperature is in Celsius. Right? So that's, 4 or 5 different ways that you can solve this problem. Right? But the complicating part in the problem was, for most people anyway, right, was storing the temperature, storing the units somehow. All right, any questions on that question? All right, so the second version of the quiz was pretty similar. Okay, so first question is again another range question. Now this one, the question says in the constructor, you're given two values that represent the extreme values of the range. Right? It didn't say A was min and B is max. It just says they're the extreme values of the range. Right? So now you have to figure out, is A the min or is B the min? Right? But that's just an if statement. Right? Throw an exception if they're equal because you can't have a range of width 0. Right? So now you just have a little if statement. You check is A less than B, then you know what min and max are. This question is almost the same as the other test. Right? Here you're given the width of the range and the maximum value of the range. Right? So can't have a width less than 0, less than or equal to 0. Right? I have a constructor that uses two values, presumably the min and the max, right, in some order. Right? But I'm only given the max, so I have to compute the min. You run into the same problem, and I have the same error. Right? You run into the same problem when I compute max minus width to get the min. It can overflow. So you have to compute it as a long. Right? And now you check, is min less than the smallest integer value? Right? If you get past that if statement, you go ahead and set this min and this max. And then the overlaps is the exact same. That should be range B. Right? So overlaps is the exact same. Right? Compute it however you want. Okay, now you have the gray value question. So this is similar to the temperature question and that you have an object that represents a value, but it can have two different representations. Right? So a gray value is either a value between 0 and 255 as an int, or it's a value between 0 and 1 as a double or float. It doesn't matter. Right? And again, it's the same thing. Right? You have to keep track of whether or not it's a floating point number or is it an integer gray value. Right? The easiest way to do that is with a Boolean field. Right? I guess you could use an enum would be better, but no one actually used an enum. And you weren't supposed to be tested on enums anyway. So a Boolean field is the easiest way to record this. If you're going to store the value, the only correct way to store it is either as a double or as a double and an int. But you can't use an int. Well, you can't use an int and have it be, if you use an int, there's a small problem. Right? So the problem is if you use an int, right, the range is from 0 to 255. Right? And so that's 256 gray values. Right? But the 0 to 1.0 as a double, that's way more. That's many more double values, many more gray values. Right? There's many more numbers between 0 and 1 than 256. Right? So if you store it as an int, you lose precision when someone gives you a double. But that wasn't treated as a large error on the quiz. Okay, so again, store it, pick your fields, right? Either one double value, a double value and an int value, and then another field to store what the type is. And now it's, oh, I didn't finish this, I guess. I guess we can do this live, so let's do this. Okay. A constructor that initializes the gray value to some caller-specified integer value. Okay, so that's gray, and they say int. Right. Okay, so I'm storing everything as double values, so I have to convert this gray value to a double. Right, and so the way you do that is divided by 255. Because these two, those are your two different representations, right? So to convert an int value to a gray value to a double value, just divide by 255. You were told that in the quiz, right? And then set is float to true. Sorry, to false. I'm sorry, false. Right, and that's it. Next question: a static factory method that returns a gray object having some caller-specified floating point value. it's going to look a lot like this as well. So some static factory method. So static gray, the user specifies it as a floating point value. So as float or something like that. It doesn't have to be as float. Right, so they're going to specify a double value for the gray value. Right. Oh, this one's a bit odd because of you have to call that one constructor. Right, now you only have the one constructor and it takes in an int, so that's a bit weird. A lot of students who answered this question stuck in a second constructor that initializes a gray value as a double. That was nice. Right, so that's definitely one way to do it. The other way to do it is to just call the other constructor anyway. Right, so just call the constructor to make a gray object and then go in and set the fields yourself. Right, so g.gray equals gray, and then g dot is float is true in this case, right? Because you created the gray value using a floating point number, right? And then return g. Right? A lot of common mistakes here were either the method wasn't static, or the method was static and then the student used this inside of the method. Right? Static method belongs to the class, doesn't belong to an object, so there is no object called this in this method. Right? You have to make the gray object here in a factory method. Right. Next question was a method that returns the value of the gray object as a floating point value. So get value, I guess. So for my particular implementation, it's easy because I'm always storing the gray value as a float. Right? So I can just return this dot gray. Right, and that's fine. And then an overridden equals method. So two gray objects are equal if and only if they have the same numeric gray value and the same representation. Right? So the same numeric value and the same representation. Right? So this is equals, so that's all the same. I guess this isn't the same. That's gray. Right? And now, so they have to have the same numeric value and the same representation. So return this gray equals other gray. Oh, yeah, right, other gray. Now you really should use double to long bits, but for the purposes of the quiz, it didn't matter. Right? And this is float, and equals other is float. Right, so you could write it that way. You could split that into two conditions. You could say, well, it doesn't matter. You can write this in a bunch of different ways, but you have to compare both fields. Right? Now, just like the other question, just like the temp question, this isn't the only way to do it. Right? You can store the gray value as both a double and an int. I don't think that saves you any effort in this case. You still need some way to indicate the type. This question is slightly easier than the temperature question because you can just use a negative value to indicate that so if you put in two fields here, private int, I guess I gray, right? So if you set gray to a negative value, then you know it's an integer floating point value, an integer gray value, sorry. If you set I gray to a negative value, then you know that it's a floating point gray value. So here it's a little bit easier to distinguish between whether or not you have a floating point or integer, right? And then you don't need the third field in this case. Right? But if you're going to do it this way, you have to set both, right? Every time you make an object, right? So in the constructor and in the factory method, you have to set both fields correctly. Otherwise, your other methods break. And that was it for the quiz. Any questions? All right. What about the exam? So the exam, format of the exam is going to be some number of very, very short answer questions. So like at most one sentence. Right? So you get some number of those. Typically, they're not programming questions. Right? So you'll get like, I don't know, somewhere between 12 and 20 or something like that. They're very short, right? They're basically covering basically rote knowledge, right? Were you actually awake in this course? Right? You should be able to answer all of the questions if you've been paying attention. So there's no trick questions or anything like that, right? It's all just fundamental knowledge. Then there's going to be some programming questions involving topics from the course. So you've already been quizzed twice. So I'm not going to quiz you specifically on stuff from the first part of the course. Right? So the questions will start at, the programming questions will start at equals. Right? In part because equals wasn't very well done on quiz 2. Right? So I'm hoping that you actually get it, everybody actually gets it sorted out for the exam. Right? So starting from this point on is where the questions will start from. Right? The programming questions will start from. The other questions can cover the entire course, right? But again, testing strictly rote knowledge. Right? Okay, so equals, you just have to remember that there's 3 things you always do, right? You have to remember there's, you check for null, right? You can use get class or instance of. You have to do the cast, and then you compare the fields, right? On the quiz, it was actually an easy 3 marks for equals. If you did the this equals object, object not null, and then the get class, right? You're automatically given 3 out of the 4 marks. Hash code is, so remember for hash code, what you have to remember for hash code, you have to remember what its contract is in relation to equals. Right? So hash code says that if 2 objects are equal, then the hash code method for both objects return the same value. Right? If 2 objects are not equal, hash code might return different values. Doesn't have to, but it might return different values. Right? The important part, though, is if 2 objects are equal, their hash codes are equal. Right? And so that has implications on how you implement hash code. Right? Whatever fields you use in equals, those are the fields that you have to use in hash code. Right? You can't use more fields in hash code than you use in equals. Comparable, right? So you need to remember that comparable is an interface, right? Compare to returns a negative value if this object is less than the other object, right? It returns 0 if they're equal, and it returns a positive integer value if this object is greater than the other object. Right? Enumerations, there's not really much to ask you here, frankly, right? So I'm probably not going to ask you anything about that specifically, right? I'm not going to ask you a programming question involving it. Relationship between classes, this stuff's fairly important. Oops, sorry. Right? And so it is important that you understand the difference between dependency, association, aggregation, and composition. Right? In terms of programming questions, it's important that you understand what it means when you have a composition. Right? So when you have 2 objects or a method, or sorry, when you have 2 objects that potentially share a reference between with one another, and you're trying to implement a composition, you have to make sure that sharing doesn't occur. Right? So you have to make sure that your object has exclusive access to its field. Right? It never releases a reference or shares a reference to one of its internal fields. You have to know what an interface is and how to create one, but that's pretty straightforward, right? An interface is just a list of methods. So that should be fairly straightforward as a programming question. And then there are basically the rest is data structures, right? So you need to know what a stack is, you need to know what a queue is, you need to know what a list is. It would be nice if you knew how to implement them all. In particular, you should know how to implement an array-based stack and a linked node-based stack and queue. For inheritance, you need to know what substitutability means, right? And what are the implications of substitutability. And then for generics, I mean, again, there's not much to ask you in generics, right? So if you have a generic type, you just replace the actual type with the generic type, right? And then everything else sort of and then everything else is basically the same. So there's not really a whole lot to ask you here. And then the rest, these are just implementing data structures. I'm not going to ask you to implement an iterator. It's probably too hard and inappropriate for an exam. So I probably won't ask you anything about that. Right? But you shouldn't be surprised to get a question where you have to implement some kind of data structure of some sort. Right? Any questions? Any specific questions, I guess, about the exam? It's only 2 hours, so it's not going to be a giant. I mean, it's not going to be much bigger than your quizzes. Any questions for me? Yes? No, I'm not asking Java doc. No. There's no Java doc in the exam. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah, like, basic knowledge. Like, there's no, like, you don't have to, yeah, basic knowledge. And I never ask you questions that force you to become a compiler, right? So you don't get questions like, does this compile? When it runs, what does it produce? Or stuff like that. I think those are inappropriate. A lot of people will ask you those, but I think that's silly for an exam, right? It'll be questions like, so for example, if x equals y is true, what is y equals x? Right? It's also true, right? Equals is symmetric, right? So other questions like that, right? So what does symmetry mean in equals? What does reflexivity mean in equals, and things like that, right? Any other questions? Yes, no, yes? All right, so I'm going to try very hard to get you back all your assignments before your exam. That basically means I'm going to be marking 4, 5, and 6 because the TAs are very slow this term. And then anything else? Yeah, so there'll be updates to the OnQ on the weekend. I'm going to try to post a bunch of review questions for you. And perhaps a sample exam. I don't know if I'll get around to the sample exam, but I will try to post a bunch of review questions with answers. And I will post an announcement describing what I described in class today. Yes? I haven't looked at that, to be honest, in a while. Let's see what we have here. Oh yeah, so yes. So this question, question 1, that's your rote knowledge question, right? Question 2 is your, yeah, this is the range object. This is the range question, right? So there's equals, right? Implement equals for a range, implement compare to for a range. Question 3, this is an inheritance question, if I remember. Oh no, it's not. You won't get a question like this on the exam. This one's basically a repeat of quiz 2, so I'm not going to ask you something like that. This one is what is it? This is a composition question, I believe. Yeah, so there's a UML class diagram question here. Then there's, yes, so this is basically a composition question. It's trying to get you to realize that a deck is a composition of a set of cards. Question 5 is an inheritance question. And question 6, you have to remember this is a 3-hour exam too, right? So this is way too long for this exam. And then question 6 is your data structures question, right? So it asks you to implement some methods from a stack class. This is a good review though. Like all these questions are actually good review. It's just you're not going to get that question here where you have to implement a whole class that does a bunch of stuff. But yeah, it's not a bad review exam. Obviously, it's too long, but any other questions for me? All right, so let's see. So my regular office hours don't work for you guys because your exam's on Thursday next week. So you'd only have 1 hour to ask me questions on Wednesday. So is it Wednesday? Is it Saturday? Wait, really? Is it the 10th? Oh, well, never mind. It's on the 10th. So, okay, so never mind. So I'm not going to change my office hours, right? You can ask me questions during Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday office hours if you have any specific questions. All right, so I'll do them online rather than in person, and I will post an announcement on OnQ. Why do they want the, They don't like you by putting it on the Saturday? It's weird. They want the exam from me by the 6th. Like, I have to print them and give them to them by the 6th. Why do they need 4 days to get anyway. All right. So anyway, yeah, that's it. All right. So I guess if I don't see you during office hours, I will see you next Saturday. All right. Thank you, everybody.